Well, greetings. I'd like to express my Bishop Estevez's blessings on everyone for being here today. This is a cause that's very near and dear to his heart. He is the Bishop of the Diocese of St. Augustine, which includes the home base of the Florida Martyrs, which is St. Augustine. And I guess I'll start with the funny story first, since that was the lead-in. I was asked in 1996 by my bishop to do a retreat for all the Catholic scouts and their families, and I was trying to find a suitable theme, if you will. So I used my mom's Catholic Girl Scout prayer book, and a card fell out, so I had to get on my knees and get under the dining room table, and it was a card on Blessed Kateri Tekakwitha, and I thought, oh, this is perfect. She's beatified, so the kids can participate in the canonization process by learning what that process is, saying the prayer for canonization. She's Native American, so we can study, based on Vatican II, the concept of enculturation, which is to take the gospel or the Mass and not put it from Latin into English, but to have a cultural expression of the gospel. And it just seemed to fall into place with scouting. So I went to my first National Native American Catholic conference, and we had an outdoor Mass, and it started pouring down rain, so everybody was shooting for cover. I end up on my knees under a picnic table in the pouring down rain with this little Jesuit named Father Pere. And so we started talking. I said, Father Pere, what do you do? And he said, well, I'm Kateri's vice postulator. And I said, how's that going? And he said, well, not so good. We can't afford a doctor to review the hospital charts of all the healings and things that are coming in. I said, well, I'm a doctor. I'll do it for free. I got the job. So that's how I got started. Kateri's road to canonization was phenomenal. I learned how to be a theological detective working with her. There's so many things that when you're studying somebody's life, not as a linear line from birth to death, but as their life unfolds and impacts people, where they lived, when they lived, living now, 100 years from behind us, and maybe 100 years ahead of us. It's an amazing journey. And so I've stayed very close to the canonization processes over time, and was quite surprised and very blessed to be asked to be one of the 4 vice postulators for the Martyrs of La Florida. So what I'd like to do today, because this is kind of more of a museum talk as well, is I wanted to divide the talk up and kind of set the stage for what was happening in Florida in the 1500s. So I'm going to discuss the military perspectives, the Spanish military objectives, the British military objectives, the Spanish civil objectives, and then go into more of the stories of the Florida martyrs. It's very interesting that this cause has tried to be started multiple times over the last 300 years. The first time it was started was in 1705 by King Philip III of Spain. That kind of fell. A Pope Clement XI, actually tried to petition for the canonization of the martyrs for the cause to be started, and that kind of fell through. And then over the last 300 years, it started and stopped and started and stopped. And I find it quite amusing that when we started this cause, we asked for the protection of Our Lady of La Leche and St. Kateri Tekakwitha to be our patronesses, and within 8 months, we were given a date for the opening of for the opening of the cause. So you put it up to the ladies; they get things done. So I'd like to start with a quote from Duns Scotus. He was a Franciscan theologian. He lived from 1266 to 1308. And he said, through the Eucharist, we go from strangers, passing each other with indifference, to becoming part of the mystical body of Jesus. We become brothers. And for me, that's such an important thing because, as I'll get into a little bit in the introduction, this is the single most important Eucharistic event, I think, in the new nation's history. I did an overview on a flow chart, and I just wanted to show you all, not to pay attention to this, but it goes everywhere. This is the flow chart of the process and where we've gotten to so far. But I found it interesting when I started connecting the lines. It looks like a crown, and it looks like Mary's crown. The one she's wearing is Our Lady of La Leche. So this isn't a journey that I can talk about in a linear fashion. So if I seem a little unkempt and all over the place, this is the flow chart I'm using. So the title of my talk is Martyrs Under Her Mantle. The story of the Martyrs of La Florida de Pascua, that's the original name of Florida, and it means the flowers of Easter, is one of the most important Eucharistic events in our continent's history. Here, the tragedies of catechesis experienced in Central and South America were overcome through the reforms of Father Bartolomé Las Casas and Father Luis de Cancer. In short summary, they insisted that catechists, priests, go out into new cultures 2 by 2 without military presence, and they must first learn the language, the culture, and the currency. Currency meaning the value. What was the value structure of a culture? Before beginning to even preach the gospel. Father Las Casas was the first priest ordained in the New World, and he was the first officially appointed protector of the Indians. And that's a role that Bishop Zumárraga was given 35 years prior without an official title. With this new methodology of catechesis, the conversion of the peoples of La Florida was a conversion of the heart. For every martyred Franciscan priest, 3 more arrived to take his place. Undaunted by poverty, hardship, the possibility of torture and death, they arrived. The Timucuan, Guali, and Apalachee, and many other nations showed an earnest desire to learn more about Christ. And an aside here, imagine, was everyone here raised Christian or Catholic, baptized? Okay, imagine being in a culture where you believed in one God, you believed in one true God, a creator God, that he was a loving God, but you didn't know how to relate to him as a human. So you looked for signs. For the native people, they looked for signs in nature, in seasons, in fires, in whatever. They looked for signs, that's something that would connect them more directly to their creator. But can you imagine the joy in their heart when they're finally introduced to Jesus Christ? I can finally relate to my creator as a human, on human terms, with a human understanding. So when you think about it that way, the conversion, especially for more peaceful peoples, can be a matter of the heart. These natives spent long hours in study with their priests and catechists. They rearranged the layout of their villages, taking the chief's hut from the center of the village, putting it to the side, and the tabernacle, the house of the Eucharist, became the center not only of the village, but the center of their lives. And when threatened with desecration and the loss of access to the Eucharist, they defended their faith with their lives. And always, always with them was their mother. The barefoot image of Our Lady of La Leche touched the heart of the indigenos. And I use the Spanish word here because many of us are raised thinking that the word Indian, the origins were, well, Columbus thought he had landed in India, so he called the natives Indians. But really, the Spanish word indigenos means indigenous, the people of the land, the owners of the land. So it was a term of endearment for the Native Americans. And in most of the documents that we have regarding the Indians in Florida, they're referred with with a lot of reverence and respect. Another interesting aside is when the Spanish landed, and even though English translations say that Menendez claimed La Florida for Spain, it wasn't a claiming or an ownership of the land. And we even have receipts now that show that the Crown of Spain paid for the land that was occupied, what's the current day Castillo de San Marco. So Spain rented the property from the natives that owned that land. The chiefs and warriors witnessing the Spanish kneeling in front of the nursing mother of Our Lady of La Leche felt a sense of the sacred and knew that this woman, this holy mother, was not only the mother of Christ, but was also their mother. And she kept them very close under her mantle. The first Marian shrine in the U.S. was built in 1609 to Our Lady of La Leche y Buen Pardo. The first Marian apparition in the United States to date was January 25th, 1704, when she appeared to our prototype martyr, Antonio, while he was being martyred on the cross. And we'll get into that story a little bit later. And it is to Our Lady of La Leche, our patroness, along with Saint Kateri Tekakwitha, and all the sufferings of the Catechist of La Florida de Pascua, that this lecture is being dedicated. First, I'd like to talk about the military aspect going into Florida. In Mexico, it was abysmal. After Cortez landed and there was this huge upheaval between the Nahuatl people, the Aztec nation, and the Spanish that had arrived, Bishop Zumárraga, at the time of the apparition of Our Lady of Guadalupe, had written a letter to the Pope saying, "If God does not directly interfere here, I fear all will be lost." Bishop Zumárraga, at the time of Our Lady's appearance as Our Lady of Guadalupe, was under house arrest. He had excommunicated the general and the lieutenant governor for crimes against the faith. They felt that they were 4,000 miles away from the King and Queen of Spain. Nobody was there to police them, and the military were running rampant with the native people. They were stealing. There was a lot of treasure to be had, a lot of gold, and there was no other military force to enforce it. Now, in Catholic Spain, if you were not Catholic, you could not hold office, and you could not be an officer in the military. So if you were excommunicated, you not only lost your position, you also lost your retirement or your stipend. So it was a big deal to be excommunicated. When Bishop Zumárraga excommunicated the major officers and delegates in Mexico, they put a death threat on him. And who was there to protect the bishop? No one. So when we look at the story of Juan Diego and Our Lady of Guadalupe, just keep in your mind this poor bishop was faced with looking at the ruin of Catholicism in the known world. We had the Reformation going on in Europe. We lost 9 million Catholics. Churches were being desecrated. We had these beautiful innocent natives in Mexico that were being enslaved, overrun, their territories, their valuables were being stolen by the Spanish military. So it was quite an ordeal. Then came Father Las Casas and Father Luis de Cancer, and these were two Dominicans that looked at what was happening in Mexico and South America and said, we can't continue to catechize like this. We have to be allowed as religious to go into a culture without a military presence so that we can gain the trust of the people. And so Las Casas and Luis de Cancer took on the most hostile group of natives on the Yucatan Peninsula, and they went in, and within 2 years the whole tribe was converted. They were beautiful, beautiful Catholics. They had a burning desire for their new faith, and the new name of their place was La Vera Paz, the true peace, which is a beautiful thing. So it was this change in missionary approach that was totally adopted by the Franciscans. And Menendez as well. Now, Menendez, who founded St. Augustine on the Feast of Our Lady's Nativity in 1565, he followed the outline of Las Casas and Luis de Cancer. He invested more money in the salvation of souls in the Floridias than the Crown did. It's estimated that the Crown of Spain invested 4.8 million ducats at the time, where Menendez invested 5.3 million of his own money. And in a letter to the king, Menendez wrote, "As for myself, I would spend all upon this undertaking, because it is of such great service to God our Lord, for the increase of our holy Catholic faith, and for the service of your majesty. And therefore I have offered to our Lord all that he may give me in this world, all that I may acquire and possess, in order to plant the gospel in this land for the enlightenment of its natives." So this is the man that we know as Menendez. He didn't go into La Florida to burn, rape, and pillage. Most of them knew that La Florida was not a wealthy land like Mexico was, which made a rotation for the soldiers very less appealing unless they were of true Catholic heart. When Menendez arrived and established the first settlement, the city took hold. He had to move it around a few times, but it really took hold in the city of Soha, which is the current day Fountain of Youth. If any of you have been to Florida, anybody been to Florida, St. Augustine, the Fountain of Youth? Yeah, so the current day Fountain of Youth was the city of Soha. And recorded in the Spanish documents in La Florida for both of their tours in Florida is only one major Indian uprising, and that was the 1597 Guali uprising. And it was actually started by one Indian, an Indian named Juanilo. And when the Franciscans were catechizing, one of the sticking points for this particular chief was going from polygamy to monogamy. He just didn't like the idea of giving everybody up. And so everything else was okay except this one concept. So he kind of stirred the pot for a couple of tribes, and five of six priests in their missions were martyred. One priest was tortured and enslaved, but he was eventually rescued. His name was Father Francisco de Avila. He was eventually rescued by the Spanish military, and when they asked him to give his testimony, he invoked clerical immunity, and he feared that his testimony would be used as grounds to execute his abductors. So the priests were very cognizant of the militaries sometimes wanting to just go in and, oh, you caused us a disservice, we're going to exact revenge. And so the priest refused to release who his captors were. Now, the Spanish military did something very unique in this situation. They sent messengers to all the chiefs involved in this uprising and said, please turn over the man responsible for this uprising, and we will try him in St. Augustine, and we will exact justice. And the chiefs did exactly that. They rounded up Juanilo, they sent him to the Castillo, and they had a trial, and he was hung, and that was the end of it. There was no back and forth. That was the end of that particular uprising. So for me, looking at this is the documentation of how the Catholic Spanish military responded in La Florida. Several of the native chiefs, the caciques, were actually considered pen pals of the king. And I'm going to kind of step away for a minute and go into that a little bit. This picture here is a picture of the Timucuan village in Soha, which is the Fountain of Youth. That is a very good representation of what was probably in existence when Menendez landed. And the importance, I think, of this picture is that it shows the high level of civilization that was already here. We know that there were 30,000 citizens in the city of Soha. We know that it was a major port of trade for what's now known as the Camino Real, or the traveling between, that went east-west from as far away as Mobile over to St. Augustine, as far north as the Chesapeake Bay, down to St. Augustine, because the Timucua Indians had easy access to limestone and oyster shells, and they could smoke meat. So they smoked fish and deer and fowl, and they could offer meat that would last for long periods of time. So it was a big center of commerce. Also, unbeknownst to the British, the Timucua had a written language. And we now have, at the University of Florida, we have over 2,000 Timucua documents that were written before the first Spanish ever landed in the New World. So the British tried to depict Native Americans as being savage, illiterate, no sense of civilization, but yet the Spanish encountered something very different, something that I know I didn't get in my history courses as a child. So that was what Menendez landed. Within 4 months of the Spanish landing, the Timucua knew how to speak Spanish, and we have documentation now. Father Parga started to translate the Catechism of the Catholic Church into Timucua. We have his handwritten account now, but halfway through, the handwriting changes. And what the linguist historians are telling us is that the Timucua took the translation away from Father Parga and started translating from the Spanish into Timucua themselves, because there were so many concepts in the catechism that they didn't understand. They didn't know what a mountain was. They didn't know what certain images were. So they tried to translate it in something that they would understand. So this gives a whole new way of looking at the history of these people. Most of the caciques, the chiefs, by the mid-1600s could read and write in Spanish and also read and write in Latin. They were very well-educated people, which is amazing. And that's why they were known as pen pals of the king, because the King of Spain welcomed correspondence from these chiefs. In one situation in Mission San Luis, which is in Tallahassee, 2 Spanish soldiers treated a young Indian boy very roughly because he was playing too loud. And when the chief, Don Patricio, asked them to apologize to this young boy, they refused. So the chief just wrote a letter to the king and kind of explained what happened. And 3 months later, the two military men that were involved in that, they lost their position, they were shipped back to Spain, and they lost 3 months of wages. So the matter was settled. But that tells you how much respect the King of Spain had for these caciques. There was an old soldier who, his name is Balthazar Francisco, and he spoke Appalachian very fluently. He had been in the Florida Panhandle for about 12 years and was on duty at the Mission San Pedro y Pablo of Patali. I bring him up because the majority of the Spanish military that came to La Florida had a very well-developed faith. They weren't your typical soldiers of fortune. And this man learned to speak Appalachian and was very dedicated to the natives that he was sent to protect and the mission he was protecting. And his mission was attacked by Colonel Moore from South Carolina. He probably suffered the most gruesome martyrdom of all the martyrs of La Florida. But during the course of his particular martyrdom, he continued to preach in Appalachia from the cross. And he was saying that the Most Holy Virgin would carry him directly to God, that his mission in life was to be obedient unto death, even death upon a cross. And that was some of the last things that he said. So you can get a picture that the military life in La Florida was very consistent with our Catholic morals and ideals, and we don't always get that in history, and it's definitely not in a lot of history books. The military in Florida kind of made a decision early on not to give the Native Americans guns for protection. Some of that was to feel out how well the catechesis was going to go, but some of it was because they weren't interested in culturing the natives into the Spanish culture. They were more interested in the Spanish becoming encultured in the native way of life. So that was one of the reasons as well. And because it was such a poor mission, there was no alcohol. So that was a very good thing, because alcohol doesn't mix well with a lot of things. The King of Spain in the mid-1600s granted full citizenship to all of the enslaved indigenos, and that was an important move because Florida became like a rescue for all of the enslaved people in the Carolinas and Virginia. The British, when they first landed in Virginia, had brought a lot of indentured servants, indentured prisoners from England, but they quickly went through those because they didn't realize how vast the land was in this country. And so the British took an active policy of enslavement. And so a lot of the people would escape British territory and come into La Florida. It was the place to go to escape. Now it's the place to go for vacation, you know, another type of escape, right? The indigenos, or the runaways, would have two requirements. One, they had to swear allegiance to the King and Queen of Spain and be willing to bear arms in the defense of the land. And the second requirement is the one that gets most often misquoted. The second requirement was that you had to read and understand the Catechism of the Catholic Church. You did not have to be Catholic. If you wanted to hold office or be a military officer, then yes, you had to be a converso, you had to be Catholic. But if you just wanted to live in that community, you did not have to become a Catholic. So that's kind of another one of those little myths that's perpetrated, I think, through time and history. And when I was a little girl and being very Catholic, I thought, how can they write this? My faith teaches me this. How could we have done all these horrible things? And number one, the church still exists today with the faith that it has today. Something has to be wrong. Somebody's not reporting the history right. So that's kind of been one of my little burrs or motivators all these years. And now to be on this particular cause, it's been a very joyous thing for me because I see, somebody did do it right. The military presence for the French Huguenots and the British in La Florida was completely different. The Huguenots landed in St. Augustine at about the same time, or not in north of St. Augustine, in Jacksonville, sorry, at about the same time that Menendez landed in St. Augustine. And they incited the natives to be totally anti-Catholic. And it was just a targeting of Catholicism. The first Jesuit to land in Mayport area, which is north of Jacksonville, he was in our country for about 4 days before he was recognized as a Catholic priest. He was attacked and martyred. His name is Father Pedro Martinez, and so he is the first Jesuit martyr in North America. The French Huguenots were overthrown quickly by the Spanish militia, and the borders seemed to be calm for a little while. Then the British came on board, and the British, their policy and their goals were total land amassment, economic gain, and enslavement of the Indians. The first raid in St. Augustine was Drake's raid on June 6, 1586. He attacked the town, he burnt the first church that was built in the city, and completely destroyed it. We did not have a stone fort at this time yet either, and so the Spanish crown reclassified St. Augustine. Instead of being a mission, they reclassified it as a presidio, which was an official military fortress. In 1665, King Charles II of England announces a new colony in the New World, Carolina, in which he included the city of San Agustin, which was like dropping the gauntlet for the Spanish crown. In 1668, there was Searle's Raid, and Searle's Raid is kind of sad. The British thought that the Spanish were hiding all their silver and all their gold and everything in St. Augustine, waiting for transport to Spain. So they came in one day and they rounded up all the residents. They murdered 60 people right off the bat. Then they set up mock trials in the town of St. Augustine, where if you were not of pure Spanish blood, if you were mulatto, if you had already intermarried with a Native American family, you were considered not pure and you were indentured and sold into slavery. And so at this point, Spain responded by building the Castillo de San Marco that you see today, that's made out of coquina. The British state that from 1702 to 1708 in La Florida, that they captured over 12,000 indigenos and took them away into the slave trade. In 1715, British law allowed that free Indians or Africans that were captured during raids in the cities in La Florida could be sold as slaves. So this was a very targeted sort of a thing. In 1721, the Spanish governor, Benavides, he organized all of the former slaves that had escaped from the British colonies into La Florida, and he organized them into a militia, their own militia, and we trace that back as Florida's first National Guardsmen. So they continued the tradition even through the two Spanish periods and through the early territory of La Florida. This militia militia stayed intact. In 1728, John Palmer attacked the mission again and tried to totally desecrate it. In 1739, James Oglethorpe attacked the city of St. Augustine. He tried to take over the Castillo, but he couldn't. The Castillo never fell into enemy hands. One of our last recorded martyrs was martyred during this attack. His name is Juan Bautista de Niño Jesus. He was a Yamasee Indian. He actually had been a Yamasee Indian that used to fight for the British and attack the converted Indians in La Florida, and he himself had a conversion. And he was martyred for refusing to deny Christ. So the summary for the British in La Florida was that they did not acknowledge the Indians as Christians, and that made it so much easier for their extermination and their enslavement. The Spanish, however, give us such a very different impression of how they viewed the Native Americans, and then later on, the Africans that were able to escape into La Florida. In Spanish, their main interest, they had a couple of goals from the civil perspective. They wanted to set up strategic centers to protect their shipping lines. They established the Presidio in St. Augustine, and they also served, the civil government served as the documentation of all transactions. And that's the beauty of the Spanish government during this time period. Everything was done in triplicate. And not only was it done in triplicate, but everything was notarized. So all of the civil information that we have, the history of what happened, and the religious history, every martyrdom that we have right now is notarized both from an ecclesiastical perspective and from a civil perspective, which is making our job as vice postulators very easy. So I'm very thankful to that. But their biggest goal for La Florida was the conversion of souls. So that's kind of an overview of the differences, I hope, between the civil and the military approach of the Catholic Spain. Remember, there was no separation of church and state. Spain was Catholic, and the Pope had conferred on the King of Spain certain duties and responsibilities for creating churches, for evangelization, for catechesis. That fell under one of the obligations of the King of Spain. So now I'd like to talk a little about the Catholic experience in La Florida. La Florida was cited by Menendez. St. Augustine was cited on August 29th, which was the feast of St. Augustine. So that's where we get our name from. And when Menendez arrived, as we talked about already, he found that the Timucuans had a written language, that there was just a wonderful reception by the Native Americans for these newcomers to their land, especially since they were willing to trade. So the Timucuas were very familiar with trade, being the ones that smoked the meat and were the center of that trade route. So they were welcoming them as colleagues in business. And the first Mass of Thanksgiving and dedication of the country in the name of God, in nombre de Dios, happened on September 9th, 1565. In 1599, just a few short years later, the first Franciscan seminary opens up. Now, when I studied this kind of rocked my world a little bit, because you're thinking outposts or total, not a developed civilization. But then I started reading more, and obviously this picture kind of tells the story as well, that this was a very advanced civilization, and then it was easy to go to start a center of higher education already. In 1605, Bishop Altamaro was the first bishop to officially visit Florida. He made the rounds. He baptized, I think it was around 1,000 names that we have that were registered in the registries for being baptized during his particular visit. In 1607, Bishop Calderon came to Florida from Havana. We were under the Diocese of Havana at that time, and he confirmed over 2,500 Native Americans during that visit. So I think that says a lot in a very short period of time, and how beautiful the catechesis was. The first class of seminarians was ordained in 1607, and I found an interesting thing in the archives in St. Augustine. There's a memoir of one of the first Franciscans to graduate from the seminary there, and he's got a little sense of humor, because in it he says, after my graduation from what we would consider minor seminary, the Franciscans, being a liberal-minded crew, allowed me to pick which religious order I wanted to enter. Well, I chose the Jesuits. And then you can just hear him, oh, silly me, you know, 5 years later, I'm finally ordained a priest. But he was born in St. Augustine, and he graduated. So this is so fascinating to me, because here's a young man who was born in St. Augustine. He graduates from the seminary there. He goes on to Jesuit seminary. His first official assignment was to the Episcopal See in Mexico City. His first official duty was to petition Rome to recognize Our Lady of Guadalupe as an official Marian apparition. That just gives me goosebumps, because we have Our Lady of Guadalupe, who is the pregnant Madonna, in a very humble shoe in Mexico City. And then we have Our Lady of La Leche in St. Augustine, who is the nursing mother in bare feet. And to have these connections that keep popping up, it's like it makes this a wonderful journey for me. Go ahead.
Were these men ordained, were they indigenous men, or these were?
Not yet. Yeah, the indigenous men, the first, and I'll get to that first gentleman that was accepted for the seminary as an indigenous, but they applied in big numbers. By 1655 in Florida, there were 70 friars, 38 doctrinas, and over 26,000 registered baptized Native Americans. That's huge. So the next picture, we have the picture, please, this is a picture of how many missions were when Bishop Calderon came for his second visit in 1674. And every one of the churches that you see is a full mission. In the catechesis of the Florida mission chain, what would happen was the priests would go out and start talking about the gospel, would start talking about Christ. The chiefs would decide to invite the priests in to continue their education. Once they did that, the village earned the title of being a doctrina. It was a place of study. So this map doesn't even reflect all of the areas that were considered doctrinas. After a certain period of time of the doctrina, and based on the Franciscans' impressions of the acceptance of the faith and the understanding of the faith, then the chief could petition to become a mission. When you became a mission, you may not have had a priest assigned to you, because there weren't that many priests, but you were allowed to have a tabernacle and a church and have the presence of the Eucharist. And that was the goal of every doctrina, was to become a mission and to have Christ live directly with them. So this is a huge number of missions in 1645, and it's just something that's new. We've never known this. A lot of the missions, we know where they are now, but we haven't been able to publicize them. One, because they're on private property, but two, because we've already had problems with people going in and trying to dig them up and destroy things. We've also already had trouble with historians that have tried to get hold of some of our documents and have tried to retranslate them and put them in a propaganda anti-Catholic view. So it's an amazing thing how much anti-Catholicism still is around today. In 1677, the Confraternity of Nuestra Señora de la Leche really took off, and it had thousands of members, and it was mostly an Indian organization that was dedicated to doing good works. Again, this kind of defies the picture of Indian culture that our French and our British compatriots have written over time, especially with the Mohawks. When I was working on Kateri's canonization, that was something that was written over and over again about how warlike the Mohawk people were, and and only the chief could distribute charity, and they were very uncharitable, and if you could no longer pull your weight in a village, that you walked out into the forest and you died. And so just to see that the Spanish documented the charity that was in the hearts of the Native Americans in Florida, I hopefully will do justice not just to the natives of La Florida, but to the natives of our entire country. It's kind of interesting. I found a little excerpt in one of our documents that was written by one of the Franciscans out in the missions, and he said, to judge an Indian's faith, a priest would ask one question: do you know Jesus? And the catechized would immediately answer, Jesus, we know him, Mary's boy. So it just tells you that their life revolved around the Eucharist, that they looked at Mary and Jesus as living among them, and they were all family. So throughout the 1600s, many of the Native Americans became catechists themselves. They were second and third generation Catholics. The mission chain grew from 38 to 157 missions. Chiefs and sons of chiefs asked to be altar boys. And so for me, it was just an amazing, beautiful time of growth and living in the faith. One of the most notable catechists is Antonio. Antonio is our prototype martyr, and this is his banner right here. Some of these banners kind of represent the major groups that are involved in this canonization, but Antonio he's the prototype, and he has his own cross. He was a very educated man. He was one of the caciques that learned Spanish and Latin very quickly. He was married with 2 children. He was a skilled musician. He was a carpenter of phenomenal repute. He was likened by the villages around him as being like Saint Joseph. He was responsible for organizing other Native Americans and building their churches and their tabernacles, and he would visit them to make sure they were doing it right, that they were being consistent and true to their faith. And because of his carpentry skills, he earned the reputation of being Saint Joseph. He had a personal devotion to Saint Joseph because, as he explained, he wanted his people, his Native Americans, to be one single holy family. He was allowed to read the gospel from the pulpit. He was an avid writer. We have his handwritten last will and testament. Antonio was martyred on January 25th, 1704, but he wrote his last will and testament in 1703, and it's one of the most beautiful things I've ever read. He wrote it, and it reads like the creed. It talks about everything he believes and why he believes it. And at the very end, of course, he's dispersing his his valuables, his land, to his family, to his church, to the Franciscans. But the very last paragraph, and I'm ashamed because I haven't done this yet, but the very last paragraph of his will, he leaves enough money for 50 masses to be said for his soul. I mean, that's a huge faith. How many of us have done that? I'm ashamed. It's like, oh, I got to go change my will. This is amazing, the strength of the faith that this man had. So that's kind of the overview for the civil, the military, and the development of Catholicism. And so now I kind of would like to go more into some of the examples of the martyrs. And I'll try not to be too graphic. All of the martyrdoms that we have are all notarized, so they're all from eyewitness accounts. Nothing that is in the current cause is a hearsay martyrdom. They're all notarized as being valid and from eyewitnesses that were there. So I'll just go ahead and start. And if I cry, just stop me. By 1700, the British adopted a military and social policy of anti-Catholicism in the New World. The British, giving the Creek Indians and at times the Yamasee and Choctaw alcohol and guns, taught them how to mock Catholicism and to target priests and the chiefs. They were singled out and tortured, sometimes for up to 9 hours before their death. So this was not a go in, kill them, and pull out thing. This was a prolonged martyrdom. while the captured Indians from a particular village were forced to watch as their priests and their caciques were tortured and martyred, in an effort to strike fear into them so that it would be easier to enslave them. Many of those being tortured continued to preach the gospel from their crosses, shouting words of encouragement, reinforcing the faith, and for those who were being tortured along with them and those in prayer that were watching. The British ended up at one point in time taking absolutely no responsibility for the cruelty of these tortures, saying that once the Indians had alcohol and guns in them, there was nothing that they could do. Eyewitness accounts, the notarized by both the civil and ecclesiastical courts, are what we use for the description of these martyrs. So our first little group of martyrs was a Spanish family. This is from the 1640s, and they were assigned. He was the first deputy governor of the Appalachian Nation, which is the area. In this area, so you can see he had quite a lot of missions under it. It was the De Florencia family. And the British came in and targeted his family specifically because they were the Spanish civil presence in that area. They martyred the father, the wife. His daughter was married and pregnant at the time. They martyred both of them, but before they martyred the pregnant daughter, they took the child out of the womb and martyred the baby, and then martyred both of them, and that's very well documented. And then the 14-year-old daughter, Antonia, being forced to watch the martyrdom of her family, continued to scream at the top, and we know at the top of her lungs, that what they were doing was wrong, and didn't they understand what they were doing? And this is wrong in the eyes of God, and you're going to go to hell if you don't repent. You have to stop what you're doing. And she just kept on at them, and they finally got tired of her. They're still torturing the other family members now, so they cut her tongue out, and she's still talking. And then they cut off a couple more. They dismember her basically, and then they finally killed her as well. But you can see these are people of great faith. What kind of catechesis they have. One of two unnamed altar servers that served Father Luis Sanchez. We don't have the altar server's name, but we know everything about their lives. The one particular one we're going to talk about was actually a chief, a young boy, but he was already named a chief. And he was captured by the British and ordered to renounce his faith and kill the priest. So he had to not only say that he wasn't Catholic, but he had to kill Father Sanchez, who he was serving. Well, he refused to do this, so he was tortured over a process of about 3 hours and was finally killed while Father Sanchez was made to watch before he was tortured and martyred. Father Juan de Pargo was the priest at Patali, and when the Indians at Patali and Mission San Luis heard that Ayubal, another mission close by, was being attacked by the British, they all pulled their forces to try to go and protect as best as they could. Father Parga went with his group of Indians. They encouraged him to stay back in the safety of the mission, but he said no, he couldn't do that. He must go and die with his children. So he was rendering medical aid, anointing the dying, giving absolution, and he was captured and martyred on the cross. They burned him slowly and dismembered him while he was on the cross. Samuel and Eliseo were two Appalachian Indians, and they were signaled out in a crowd of natives that had been captured for slavery. And they were signaled out because they were wearing their crosses. And the British ordered them to remove their crosses, and they refused to. And so because they refused to stop teaching the faith, their tongues were cut out, and then they were tortured as well. Cacica Maria, one of the 11 women chiefs that we have that are martyrs in this process, was from Mission Santa Cruz de Ichatefun. Along with 3 other caciques and a 10-year-old altar server named Epifanio, they were drowned for proclaiming that it was better to lose their lives than lose their faith in Jesus Christ and be away from their churches and the missionaries who were like their own fathers. So these people, they died shouting this. They weren't afraid. Manuel, here we are to our first little Appalachian who was accepted to the seminary. Manuel was a 13-year-old sacristan at the Mission Virgin Maria Immaculata. He was so on fire. He had been an altar boy, moved up to the level of sacristan. He was in charge of keeping the church clean and the tabernacle protected. He had petitioned for 2 years to go to the seminary. He was finally accepted to the seminary in San Agustin when his little village was attacked by the British. He was in the chapel when it was set fire, so he didn't even leave the chapel to see what was happening in his village, but his mother and father had been murdered, and 250 of the natives from his village had been rounded up for slavery. But while he's in the church, he's screaming. He doesn't know who's out there. Somebody come help, bring water. We have to put the fire out. You know, Jesus is going to burn. And he's pulling the tapestries off the wall, and you just get this image that this 13-year-old boy is doing everything he can to protect Christ in the tabernacle. When 2 Creek Indians and a British officer come in, and they start to mock him, and they tell him, get on your knees and pray to your God to put this fire out. We're not helping you. And poor Manuel, I mean, at this point he's in panic, and he kneels down on his knees and he puts his hands up to pray to God, and they cut off both of his arms at the elbow. So now he's bleeding, but he's still preaching. And so they do what they like to do when they're still preaching, and they cut out his tongue and they take out all of his teeth, but he's still preaching. And they finally pull him out as the tabernacle's burning. They make him watch as the chapel finishes burning, and then they drown him in the trough for the animals outside of the church. So that is Manuel's story. But a 13-year-old, to have that kind of faith and to keep his eyes on the Eucharist with that kind of strength and courage, I can't imagine that. Father Agustin Ponce de Leon was born of Spanish parents in 1689 in San Agustin. He was ordained at the Franciscan Seminary there in St. Augustine and was stationed in many of the mission chains around St. Augustine. He was stationed at Mission Nombre de Dios Chiquito, which was a little mission south of St. Augustine that served both the Indians in that area and the outpost, Fort Menendez, which was the southern fort to kind of protect Castillo de San Marco and St. Augustine. The creeks on this particular raid went past St. Augustine and went down to his mission. He was in St. Augustine because the Mission Nombre de Dios had just been attacked again and burned, and it was the neighboring priest's job, when he found out that a mission had been attacked, to go sift through the rubble and try to rescue the ciborium, the crucifix, the candlesticks. So he was up at the mission trying to sift through what was left of the little church there when he got word that the Creeks had gone into his village and stolen 200 of his parishioners, including his 2 altar boys. And Father Agustin is described as being a giant of a man by the Timucua. Now, Timucua were usually around 6 feet tall. So if this guy's a giant, he's like Father John or something, he's like huge. So the Timucua that gave the Eyewitness report said that for every 4 Timucua running steps, it only took Father Agustin 2 to catch up with him. So that's how big and how fast he was. But he went to try to save his altar boys, and they had snuck by him and ended up at the Mission Nombre de Dios. So he turned around and he caught up with them, and he's running after them with his hands in the air to show that he had no weapons, and yelling, "Stop, stop, take me instead. You'll get more for me in ransom than you will for these 2 small altar boys when you sell them as slaves." And so the Indians, the Creeks, turned around and they hit him with a volley of arrows, and he fell to the ground. But he was a big guy, so he got back up and he goes running after them again. Well, at this point in time, the Creeks turn around with the 2 altar boys, and a British officer comes up behind them. And the story is that they tomahawked him, they clubbed him, and as he lays dying, they make him watch as they martyr the 2 altar boys too. So our only consolation is that all 3 went to heaven together. But this happened at the site of Our Lady of La Leche's chapel today. So I'd like to end with the martyrdom of our prototype martyr, Antonio Anisia. Because this is such a huge when we started this process in 2014, we had our first Catholic history conference that we'd had in many years. And out of the Catholic history conference, we formed a committee to say, let's relook at reopening the cause for these Florida martyrs. The story that they tell about American Catholic history is very important. Well, at the time, we only had the names of 7 Native Americans, and so it wasn't a big, we knew that there were thousands more that were martyred for their faith, but we thought, well, a king tried it, a pope tried it, we'll try it too. And within weeks of forming a committee, we petitioned Bishop Parks, who is the Bishop of Tallahassee, Pensacola, if he thought this was a good idea again. He wrote to Rome, asked for the cause to be re-looked at and reopened again. In 2 months, we got word that, oh yes, go ahead, we want you to open it up again. Within 4 months after that, we were assigned a postulator. And then in July 2015, so we're talking maybe a year since we started all of this process. By July 2015, we had 85 names, documented histories, just like the ones that I just shared with you. And on October 12th, 2015, last year, the cause was officially open with 85 names. So in the process of that, you know, they've changed canonical ways of how for sainthood. And when you have a big group like this, you can only have one prototype martyr now. In the past, you could have 2 or 3, especially if different groups were represented. So we have Dominicans, we have Franciscans, we've got 1 Jesuit, we've got all these Native Americans. So we had 4 special interest groups vying for who the prototype was going to be. That kind of slowed us down a little bit, but we finally came to consensus, and our consensus was with Antonio. Antonio was the chief at Ayubale, and he heard about Colonel Moore's attack. He was the chief at San Luis, but he heard about the attack at Ayubale, and he rallied his braves to go so that they could provide any support or protection that they could for the people of Ayubale. He was captured. They knew that he was an Anija. He was the second in command. They really saved one of their worst martyrdoms for the chiefs at Ayubale. He was placed on a cross along with 2 other caciques, Francisco and Domingo, and they were, all the Indians that were captured with them were all tied with leather straps and were forced to watch this particular martyrdom. The Creeks lit fires under the crosses. They were small fires, but they were fires. And they hung them on the cross with the leather straps. They would make lacerations in their muscle groups, and inside the wounds they would put the hot embers from the fires. So it was a very slow, this is, Antonio was on the cross, we know for sure, for 9 hours. But throughout all of this, they would proclaim their belief in Jesus Christ. They shouted that they would be with him soon. Antonio encouraged everyone to hold on to the faith that the fathers had taught them. And so this went on for 6-7 hours. And slowly people were getting more and more quiet. There were 54 people total martyred at this particular martyrdom. Shortly before Antonio died, he got this breath of fresh air, and all of a sudden he is yelling from his cross, be strong, my brothers, be strong. Our Lady of the Mestizo face is here at his side, and he is looking into her eyes, and in her eyes he is getting the courage and the strength that he needs to endure this martyrdom, and he wants to share it with his brothers that are on the cross. And then he got very quiet again, and at sunset he died proclaiming the faith. So that's Antonio's story, and it's amazing to me because he says that Our Lady who appeared to him from the cross had the mestizo face. Who else has the mestizo face? Our Lady of Guadalupe. That's how she's described. And one of Our Lady of Guadalupe's most important lines, I think, that she tells to Juan Diego is, look to my eyes. In my eyes you will see in the center of my eyes, you will see all that I hold most near and dear to my heart, which is a family. We know through Dr. Tunsman's work on the optics of the eyes that in the very center of Our Lady of Guadalupe's eyes is a family, a mother, a father, 3 children, and a set of grandparents. She wants the family to stay together. And what was Antonio dedicated to? He was dedicated to his people becoming one holy family, united in Christ. So his martyrdom for me is just the high point, if you will. It sums everything up that Florida Catholicism was in the early days. So the British, it was religious persecution at its best with no ramifications. These weren't just raids intended on stealing people for the slave trade. These deaths weren't intertribal disputes to exact revenge. The British did not find the land in Florida attractive. There were no treasures. There was no gold. These were the deaths of martyrs, the named and unnamed. This was primarily an attack on Catholicism, intended to strike fear and intended to allow more human enslavement. So I think that the British were a little surprised about how poorly the Indians responded to their plan, meaning that they thought everyone would just roll over and become enslaved. But the truth is that in many of the instances, 1 out of 2 or 1 out of 4 of every Native Americans would rather die than leave their mission and leave their Eucharist. So this is a brief snapshot of what happened in Florida, of the development of Catholicism. Spain didn't come in and have the Indians wearing Spanish garb and building Spanish cities and developing a Spanish culture. The Franciscans came in with purely the intent for enculturation of the gospel. So it's a beautiful story. It's just come to light in the last 2 years. There's nothing published right now. The historical commission that we have now that the cause is officially open, the historical commission is about to finish their documents and their close. And once the historical document is finished and the tribunal has interviewed all of the historians, we will be able to publish this story in its entirety. So that will be beautiful. We know that this will probably happen within the next year, sometime in 2017. The tribunal that we have on our particular canonization has been so dedicated, and they've told the vice postulators a couple of months ago that the tribunal will not be the ones that slow this canonization effort down. So we're very blessed to have a tribunal that's as active as they are in our particular process. So I'd like to end with a little prayer that was written in 1731 by Father Thomas Barrios, and it's a prayer that was written to the martyrs. May you, O holy martyrs, in memory of who you once were, and remembering who you are now, pray for us. Move our hearts, which are at times like dust-dry stones, that we may lead lives of devotion and penitence and detachment from the world. And if the holy martyrs were burned alive for their holy faith, then may we live with an ardent zeal, consuming our lives to preach the gospel. Amen. Thank you.